General Hospital spoilers for Wednesday, January 21st reveal that Agent Joss arrived before dawn, her boots still dusted with the grit of the road, the weight of her new clearance badge pressing cold against her chest. She had known the assignment would be serious. Brennan never summoned anyone without purpose, but nothing prepared her for the sharp gravity settling over the briefing room the moment she stepped inside. Brennan didn't waste time. His expression was carved from steel, his posture tense enough to turn the air brittle. When he began outlining the situation surrounding Cullum, the danger unfolded in layers each deeper, darker, and more insidious than the last. Joss felt her pulse shift, the quiet anticipation inside her turning into a slow, creeping chill. Brennan explained that Cullum was no longer a threat operating in the shadows. He had evolved into something far more unpredictable. His alliances fractured and reshaping with disturbing speed. The intelligence gathered in the last 72 hours suggested Cullum was preparing for a move, a calculated strike designed to destabilize key targets, tied to Port Charles. And as Brennan's tone lowered, Joss understood the real blow before the words even left his mouth. Carly might already be in his line of sight. The room seemed to shrink around her, the overhead lights suddenly too bright, too sterile, their hum vibrating at the edges of her nerves. Joss had trained for this. She had faced down danger before, but the thought of her mother tangled in the orbit of a man like Cullum brought a sharpness to her focus that Brennan immediately recognized. He warned her that emotional entanglement was the most efficient weapon Cullum could exploit, that her fear, if she let it guide her, would be the very crack he needed to strike. Yet even as Brennan explained the protocols, even as he drilled into her the cold precision required for the mission, Joss could sense the subtle shift taking shape beneath his words. He wasn't just preparing her for surveillance. He was preparing her for a battlefield of psychological warfare, one Cullum excelled at manipulating. It became clear that Brennan's true concern wasn't merely Cullum's interest in Carly. It was the possibility that Cullum had already anticipated Joss's involvement. This alone altered the foundation of her assignment. Brennan tasked her with following Cullum's movements, mapping his interactions, analyzing his coded behavior patterns, but he also emphasized that Joss was to remain invisible. Cullum had a talent for reading people, for turning his observers into pawns without them realizing it. Joss needed to be perfect, precise, unreachable, and yet Brennan's final warning lingered in the air long after he said it. Cullum thrived on creating chaos that shook families apart. If he had marked Carly as a point of leverage, it meant he was no longer simply seeking operational advantage. He was looking to break something personal, something human, something that would send shockwaves through anyone connected to her. As the weight of her mission settled onto her shoulders, Joss felt a transformation stir within her. The adjustment was subtle at first, a quiet hardening of will, but the more she absorbed Brennan's intel, the more defined the shift became. She wasn't just stepping into the role of a field agent, she was stepping into the complex, volatile space between loyalty and duty. Her mind replayed every warning Brennan issued, stitching together the blueprint of a threat unlike any she had ever faced. Cullum's unpredictability meant the surveillance would not be routine. He changed direction without pattern, responded to danger with creativity rather than caution, and targeted emotional weaknesses with near-surgical precision. Joss knew immediately that this mission would test every discipline she had learned. She would have to step closer to Cullum than she ever intended, walk parallel to the very path he carved with calculated malice. Brennan's analysis suggested that Cullum had already begun disassembling old alliances and forging new ones in the underbelly of the city. People who crossed him disappeared from records. Places he touched became compromised without warning. And now, with Carly's name hovering at the edge of Brennan's concern, the entire operation shifted into higher alert. Joss could see the unease flicker behind Brennan's steady gaze, a rare crack in a man who never allowed himself to falter. But the true turning point came when Brennan slid a classified file toward her, its contents sealed with multiple layers of encryption. Inside it, Joss found a document outlining Cullum's psychological profile, his escalation patterns, and the newest piece of intel that had forced Brennan to accelerate her assignment. In the past 48 hours, Cullum had requested intel on individuals connected to Sonny's inner circle, and Carly's name appeared twice. Joss felt the room tilt for the second time. This wasn't random. This wasn't incidental. Cullum was preparing something deliberate, and so the adjustment within Joss deepened. She accepted that her mission was not only about observation, it was about preemptive protection. Every move she made from this moment forward would have to be calculated, silent, and surgically precise. The idea of being forced to remain in the shadows while the threat crept closer to Carly ignited a pressure inside her chest that she refused to let Brennan see. But Brennan saw it anyway. He studied her with a measured understanding, as if recognizing the exact moment when the mission stopped being a task and became something far more personal. As the briefing concluded, Joss stepped out of the room with her mind sharpened into a blade. Brennan's warnings echoed like drumbeats. Cullum was dangerous, unpredictable, and accelerating. The adjustments rippling through the situation were becoming irreversible. And now, Jocelyn Jacks was stepping directly into the heart of it, knowing full well that the next move she made could determine not only the success of her mission, but whether her mother survived the storm that Cullum was preparing to unleash. Tracy's offer landed in Jason's world like a blade slipped beneath the surface, silent, precise, and far more dangerous than it first appeared. She approached him not with panic, not with desperation, but with the measured confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating the shadows of the Quartermain Empire. Jason knew that look. It meant disaster was closer than anyone wanted to admit. He had already sensed the shift in the air long before Tracy spoke it aloud. Drew's behavior had been deteriorating in quiet increments, flashes of paranoia, strained conversations, violent edges that appeared in his voice when Michael's name was even mentioned. Jason had told himself it was stress, pressure, the weight of too many things falling apart at once. But Tracy saw what Jason refused to confront. Drew's descent had crossed a threshold, and now he had become unpredictable enough to turn Michael into collateral damage. When Tracy finally laid out her proposal, the room felt colder, heavier, as if every word carried a storm behind it. She told Jason that the Quartermains were fracturing, that Michael's position was slipping, and that Drew, fueled by betrayal, humiliation, and his obsession with regaining control, had already begun maneuvering pieces into place to isolate Michael legally and financially. Jason didn't flinch, but inside, something shifted. Tracy rarely warned, she predicted, and she was rarely wrong. The newest adjustment in the situation crystallized with terrifying clarity. Jason wasn't dealing with the brother he once fought beside. He was dealing with a man spiraling into something unstable, someone who had convinced himself that Michael stood in the way of his survival. Drew's reasoning had become jagged, broken, shaped by wounds and paranoia that Jason could no longer reach. Tracy's offer wasn't simply tactical, it was an acknowledgement that the balance of power had changed. She wanted Jason to intervene not as a Quartermain, but as a soldier, a protector, a weapon. And Jason recognized the weight of what she was asking. Step into the shadows once more, not to eliminate a threat, but to contain a brother who had become one. The unspoken truth lingered between them. If Jason refused, Michael would be left exposed to a conflict he couldn't possibly win. If he accepted, he would be pulling himself into a war within the family, one that could tear apart everything the Quartermains had rebuilt since Alan and Edward's time. Jason walked away from the conversation with Tracy's words echoing like distant thunder. He replayed every moment with Drew in recent weeks, the tension in his jaw, the abrupt mood swings, the way his eyes hardened when discussing the trial, the way he spoke about Michael not as a brother but as an obstacle. The darker the memories grew, the more Jason felt the shift inside himself, an adjustment he hadn't wanted to face but could no longer deny. He had always protected Michael. Since the day the boy was born, through every broken moment, every dangerous turn, Jason had shielded him with his own life. And now, standing at the edge of another war, he felt that old instinct rising, a silent vow sharpening like steel in his hands. But this time, the threat wasn't an enemy from the outside. It was Drew, the man Jason had risked his life to save, the man he once trusted, the man who was now unraveling into someone capable of harming Michael. Without even recognizing the line he crossed, Jason felt the conflict tearing at him from within. How do you protect someone you love from someone you used to love just as deeply? How do you stop a man who no longer knows he's the one starting the fire? Tracy's proposal forced him to face a truth he didn't want to admit. Protecting Michael might require confronting Drew in a way that could shatter their bond forever. It wasn't a choice Jason wanted. It was a choice the situation demanded. As the day wore on, Jason tracked the newest signs of Drew's obsession. He noticed the late-night calls, the aggressive legal inquiries, the coded messages Drew sent through intermediaries who owed him favors. He saw the pattern forming a tightening net meant to corner Michael, to undermine him from angles that couldn't be traced back to Drew directly. It was calculated. It was personal. It was escalating. And Jason's instinct screamed that if he didn't intervene now, the damage would be irreversible. He realized Tracy hadn't come to him as a strategist. She had come to him as someone who understood the cost of doing nothing. The Quartermains had survived betrayal, blackmail, corporate wars, and personal tragedy, but they had never faced a crisis where one heir was preparing to quietly destroy another. By nightfall, Jason made his decision. The adjustment had taken root inside him, fully now calm, resolved, deadly in its precision. He would protect Michael. He would dismantle every trap Drew set. He would neutralize every threat before it touched his nephew. And if stepping into Tracy's plan meant confronting Drew head-on, then he would accept that burden alone. Because Jason knew something no one else wanted to admit. This wouldn't end with a conversation. It wouldn't end with an apology. It wouldn't end with family loyalty. This would end the moment Drew realized Jason had become the wall between him and Michael, and the moment Jason accepted that he might have to break Drew to keep him from breaking everything else. It was the beginning of a new fracture, a new war, a new adjustment in the Quartermain legacy, and Jason was already preparing for the fallout. Lucas felt the weight of the news long before he spoke it aloud, a pressure that sat like stone in his chest as he watched Marco pace the dimly lit room, with the restless energy of a man who could feel the world shifting beneath his feet. The message he carried was not merely unfortunate, it was the kind that altered the trajectory of everything they thought they understood. Sidwell had made his move, quietly, precisely, with the kind of surgical cruelty that defined him. Sidwell had altered the balance of power again, and this newest adjustment sent a chill through every corridor of Port Charles. Lucas finally forced the words out, watching Marco's expression unravel in slow motion as the implications hit him. A key contact had gone dark, a safe channel had been compromised, and Sidwell's men were already moving into territories they had no right to touch. Marco froze, absorbing the revelation as if it were a blow to the ribs, because he understood instantly. What Lucas had been trying to shield him from this wasn't just a setback. It was a declaration of intent. Sidwell was no longer playing around the edges. He was stepping into their path with full force, discarding subtlety in favor of control. The adjustment in Sidwell's behavior was unmistakable. He had grown bolder, more erratic, driven by an obsession that had begun twisting his judgment into something dangerous and unpredictable. Marco felt the shift like a tightening coil around his throat, because he knew that Sidwell's escalating boldness was not random, it was personal. The man thrived on pressure, on destabilizing the ground beneath his enemies until they had nowhere left to stand. Lucas continued, his voice low, steady, the only anchor in a room suddenly filled with invisible threats. Sidwell had intercepted their latest attempt to move information out of the city. He had identified a leak in Marco's communication line. He had even begun following patterns that Marco spent years hiding. It was no coincidence. It was targeted, deliberate, and the worst part was how cleanly Sidwell had executed it, leaving no trace except the cold certainty that he had intended Marco to know exactly how vulnerable he had become. Marco felt the panic rising, not in wild bursts, but in deep, controlled waves, the kind that forced a man to reevaluate every decision he had made in the last 6 months. He could feel Sidwell circling him like a predator who took pleasure in dismantling his prey. Piece by piece, the danger was real, close, creeping under the surface of every breath. Lucas warned him that Sidwell had shifted into a new phase, one defined by aggression, rather than observation. The calculated restraint Sidwell once relied on had slipped away, replaced by something unhinged and volatile. This was not a man testing boundaries. This was a man preparing to erase them. Marco clenched his fists, understanding with brutal clarity that this adjustment in Sidwell's behavior meant they were out of time. The game had changed, the rules rewritten in the space of a single message, and the knowledge that he was now the center of Sidwell's focus tightened around him like a vice. Lucas moved closer, lowering his voice even further as he revealed the final piece of the report. Sidwell had mentioned Marco by name, not in a threat, not in a warning, but in a calculated prediction, a promise of what he intended to do next. Marco's pulse hammered against his ribs because he knew what that meant. Sidwell did not name a man unless he had already planned how to break him. And this newest danger wasn't just approaching, it was already unfolding in the spaces they hadn't yet examined. The room felt smaller now, suffocating, thick with a peril neither of them could fully measure. Marco realized that Lucas had not brought him bad news. He had brought him a countdown, and the only question left was whether Marco could adapt to this new reality before Sidwell delivered the next blow, one that might destroy far more than just the fragile safety Marco had been clinging to. Laura felt a tremor of unease settling into her bones long before Kevin finished speaking. His warnings came slowly, at first measured, clinical, shaped by years of observing human behavior, but as he continued outlining the shifts he had noticed, a palpable urgency began threading through his voice. Laura had heard Kevin express concern before, but never like this. There was something in his eyes, a deep worry that no professional detachment could mask. Something that made her stomach twist with fear. Kevin spoke of small adjustments, subtle but unmistakable changes in the emotional landscape surrounding their family. Changes he believed were tied directly to the growing instability in the forces circling around Ace. Each detail he described carved deeper into Laura's fragile hope that things would eventually settle. Instead, the picture Kevin painted was one of escalating tension, of a tightening influence threatening to shape Ace's future in ways neither of them fully understood. Laura listened, her chest constricting as if each word pulled another thread loose from the safety she was desperately trying to weave around the boy. She had raised children in the midst of turmoil before. She had faced threats, betrayals, political wars, and personal tragedies, but nothing frightened her as deeply as the idea that Ace, so small, so innocent, might be swept into a battle far larger than himself. Kevin's warning wasn't abstract. It wasn't hypothetical. He had seen patterns emerging, the kind that preceded fractures in a family, violence in a community, chaos in a fragile mind. The new adjustment, as he called it, was not just a shift in circumstances, but a shift in intent. Those seeking influence over Ace were becoming more desperate, more cunning, and more willing to break boundaries that once seemed unthinkable. Laura felt the room around her grow colder as she absorbed the implications. If Kevin was right, and he usually was, they were no longer dealing with people acting out of fear or grief. They were dealing with individuals who believed controlling Ace meant controlling the future. And that kind of belief, twisted by ambition and resentment, bred catastrophe. Laura's heart pounded as she tried to steady her breathing. She thought of Ace's bright eyes, his small hands gripping her own, the fragile trust he had already learned to place in her. The idea of that trust being shattered by forces he couldn't comprehend filled her with a dread so consuming it felt like sinking. Kevin stepped closer, lowering his voice not out of secrecy, but out of recognition of how fragile her emotional balance had become. He explained that the adjustment he sensed was accelerating, gathering momentum. Someone he didn't know who yet had begun manipulating the narrative around Ace, subtly shifting perceptions, planting doubts, reshaping alliances behind closed doors. The dangerous part was not the manipulation itself, but how expertly it was hidden. No one was panicking. No one suspected a storm, and that invisibility made it infinitely more lethal. Laura pressed her fingers to her temples as if she could push the fear back into place, but it kept rising, thick and suffocating. She knew from experience that when people began seeing a child as leverage, as a weapon, as a symbol, the situation always spiraled into territory that left scars on everyone involved. The last thing she wanted was for Ace to grow up shaped by fear and conflict, yet the path ahead seemed to be steering him toward exactly that. Kevin gently reminded her that fear could cloud judgment, but his expression showed that even he was fighting to remain steady. He confessed he had never seen such rapid shifts in emotional dynamics around a child before. Someone was pushing the situation toward volatility. The new adjustment wasn't random, it was engineered. And if they didn't identify the source soon, the damage could become irreversible. Laura felt a chill trace down her spine. She thought of Nicola's, of Esm, of every fractured bond and unresolved wound tied to Ace's existence. Each carried danger, resentment, desperation. Each carried a history capable of spawning new threats. And now, with the subtle rise of manipulation Kevin sensed, she realized they were standing on the edge of a fault line that could split without warning. A silent terror began to take shape inside her as she imagined the possibilities. Would Ace be taken, used, pulled into a custody war escalating into something darker? Or worse, would someone try to shape him the way others had once tried to shape Spencer? Laura could not bear the thought. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was thin and trembling. She didn't ask Kevin if a disaster was coming. She asked when. And the worst part was the silence that followed. Kevin didn't answer because he didn't need to. The truth hung between them like a storm cloud. Something catastrophic was already unfolding, just beyond their line of sight. And unless they intervened with precision and speed, Ace would be caught at the center of a conflict capable of destroying not only his innocence, but the fragile balance of their entire family. Laura's fear crystallized into something sharper, not panic, but resolve. She knew what had to be done, but even as determination began to harden inside her, she couldn't shake the sickening realization that whatever adjustments were happening behind the scenes were moving faster than she could respond. And that meant the next move might not belong to her at all. It might belong to the threat already closing in on Ace's future. Nina arrived with the intention of offering Kai a few gentle words of guidance. Nothing more, just a moment of steady reassurance for someone clearly overwhelmed by the chaos unfolding around Willow's trial. But the moment Kai began speaking, Nina sensed an unsettling shift. His voice wavered. His thoughts circled too close to the edges of something forbidden. And then almost carelessly, almost without realizing the weight of his own words, Kai let slip a detail that pierced the silence. Like a blade. A detail he should never have known. A detail that pointed directly to the darkest adjustment in the entire case. Willow was the one who shot Drew. Nina froze, her breath catching as the truth hung between them like a live wire. Kai paled instantly, aware too late that he had crossed a line that could unravel everything. The revelation sparked something dangerous inside Nina, not anger, but obsession. A rising need to understand how deep the lie went, and how long Willow had been manipulating those around her. This accidental confession rewrote the entire landscape, turning caution into suspicion, and suspicion into a storm brewing beneath Nina's ribs. For the first time, Kai realized he wasn't just carrying a secret, he had become part of a growing nightmare. And as Nina's expression hardened with dawning clarity, he understood that this slip might ignite consequences far more explosive than either of them were prepared to face.